I mean, you're here, right?
Yeah.
My colleagues are here today.
Which is this Friday. You can
Yes, I know. I told you.
It's just for them to read later because people don't know when they're spoken at. Yeah, they're welcome.
But it is a bit. How long is the session?
Oh, yeah.
Fair share, and I don't think it. As far as I would have been helpful.
Very much for the caching.
I did actually. No, I did get this. I had to separate myself from my children so I could come and talk to me. But I did get to I can guess you.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Because I wanted to get to that.
Yeah.
Okay, now what do we do? Yeah. So I did get to the end.
Part of it.
Yeah, no, but it's just about talking about it. It's
all sorts of groups.
You're often thinking, I should be doing this much less I should be saying this, you know.
I was cleaning my house and I found that they were just at my great.
And I had somebody,
My mother's family came in Scotland in the 1760s. And all of a sudden, it was something that was
Within the
freedom by the ultimate. It was really upsetting.
so we had a great,
So,
I thought we had a really good conversation.
you know, total. And so, in context,
There's obviously something.
I've always had this family narrative that
Personalize that too.
go beyond.
so this one about the first guy, he's on the first guy.
But I settle on yourself.
Yeah.
And then,
So
With those times,
Because I'm assuming that prompted the conversation. That's what
I wonder what the best way to
kind of where I was
I was thinking it'd be nice if you could do it in person.
living
I
with
mean,
that
there's like
non-closure.
we can actually
Start to wrap up.
Walking away from houses.
you know, that would be great if you could do that.
We got something new. I was just gonna get another glass. We got all day long.
I like potato chips.
I was just.
Yes.
That's what I was gonna do.
I see some granola.
Yes, potato chips and granola. I came here for the
Duration.
Yes, this is a duration retreat, and so I came prepared with long-term snacks.
And is it, what is in the
At least
box?
with the granola, I brought enough for everyone to share.
Oh, nice. I actually thought
What's in the
about
box?
bringing mixed nuts.
He comes with granola for long-term. I kind of ensure. It's the age difference.
I'm going for the
That's actually
granola. I'm thinking, aren't I older than you?
And what is in the box? Yeah, what's beneath you? Beneath is that pot?
This? The tripod?
Oh, okay. It kind of looks
Which
like
I
a
don't think is
Diet Coke.
She's just searching out all the food. Let's come back together as a whole group.
Sure.
And you're more than welcome to keep these norm cards if you'd like to for future
Where's the norm
future
card?
meetings. They're just
Green ones?
the green ones there.
I wrote it all down.
But did you?
Those are sideways
They don't,
for
they
us.
don't have the explanations of them, but you can keep them for your meetings if you think that they'll be helpful. We use them to just kind of say, okay, remember, we just experienced discomfort or what have you.
We can keep them at the dais, maybe we can get one for each of us.
So just any questions that you have, thoughts or comments that you'd like to share as a group about these norms? Anything stand out for you or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because I'm going to have problems with some of these norms because of trust issues.
Yeah. Would you be willing to give an example of like a norm that you'd struggle with?
I would say sharing anything about myself personally with the people in this room.
Yeah.
I'm the only R in the room, total.
The only R.
Republican.
Okay.
So when you say
mentioned
my brother's a
Republican.
Republican and people laugh, that's not a very comfortable spot for me. So yeah, sharing in that situation is going to be certainly difficult.
Yeah. Now, was that an experience where you felt kind of, did you feel offended in that moment?
No, I feel stereotyped usually.
Okay.
I mean, I feel that stereotype regularly.
Yeah. So, how is that even influenced in some ways just how you were able to hear anything that I shared afterwards? Like, oh wow.
Oh no, I like everything you shared. I mean,
Yeah.
it didn't really affect that so much as it's just a reminder.
Of the dynamics of difference, right? Yeah. So here's what's a challenge in it. I don't recommend that we go around and we're vulnerable to everyone. Right? That just isn't going to work, right? And that these norms aren't always going to apply in every situation. I don't go around and take risk and tell my stories. The work that you have to do on behalf of all kids is very difficult work. And I think that you will be more effective the closer that you are to one another. The more you understand each other's stories and where you're coming from, that you're able to talk about, Dawn, like, hey, when you laughed about this, here's what came up for me. It created a feeling of isolation or marginalization, or this is an area where I feel like I can't always bring myself into the room because I am, as you said, the R word. And so this is where then we can be more mindful. We can't be mindful if you don't bring that story or that experience into the space. Does this make sense to you? So that's an example, what you just did, of what Courageous Conversations is. Another reason why it's Courageous Conversations is because we may invalidate Dawn as she goes to share and say, oh, Dawn, you're taking that too seriously, or that's not what we mean, my cousin's a Republican, right? Or what have you, right? As a way to then minimize that your experience is real, right? So it's a great example of it. So what would you need to do to develop trust and to develop relationship? Remember, you're going to have some new board members coming in. How are you going to talk about the needs of all of these kids that you are being asked to serve, or you're charged with serving, and you can't do some of the work that's required to eliminate your or address some of your some of the ways in which you've taken in messages. Does that make sense to you? So naming that, how do you get to know each other? Whether it's even one-on-one, going out and having coffee with each other, and getting to know each other better, I believe that it's a critical part of this work. That's what we're getting ready to talk about in a moment. Thank you. Sometimes, even just that's, I'm glad or I'm thankful that my joke didn't offend you in this, but it is very likely that when I do say that, that as people laugh and it becomes a joke, that people are offended. Right?
Well, you think it was a joke, but it certainly highlights a stereotype that in your family unit, how could there be a Republican?
Yeah.
Whereas I know many Republicans that would have no problem with your family unit. So that stereotype that exists isn't, I mean, we're all individual people. We all have individual feelings about things and different things, and to draw that assumption is always just a stereotype.
Yeah, yeah. And it has an impact on how you're able to show up in the room. Yeah, and when. Yeah. And so what needs to happen to eliminate those barriers? And Dawn, what I'm proposing to you is that you're going to have to keep taking risks like you just did now, and show up in spite of what your feeling of kind of safety is in the room, right? Because there is no safety in these conversations. That's what we would like to have happen. There really isn't comfort in these conversations. When I feel comfortable is when I talk and engage with people who think or have the similar experiences that I have. It's always a risk when I'm stepping across cultures to engage. Any other thoughts? Thank you for that. Any other thoughts?
I was just thinking that the last two, the non-closure and no fixing in our sort of our respective roles, is oftentimes a tough one, because I think that's what the people we serve look to us for.
Yeah.
Is closure, certainty, fixing problems,
Yeah.
making their worlds right.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, it's sort of outside kind of interpersonal realm, but it's organizationally, I think that's always
Yeah.
a challenge. And then these issues that, you know, they are messy and they are long-term, and they do, they don't lend themselves to easy soundbite quick fix solutions. And I think that's something we struggle with.
And I find that leaders can feel that heavy burden of having to undo institutional isms that existed long before any of you were even born. Like, you're going to come in and all of a sudden do something magical. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility and an obligation to do your part in dismantling it, but you are not going to solve all the problems having to do with education or other, right? It's very multifaceted, and again, it's existed for a long time. However, we can't also operate under the assumption that because it existed before we were born, that there's nothing that we can do. It is big. What's our pieces? Any other thoughts? Is this helpful to you? Okay, all right. I try to keep these norms front and center, even when I'm in the grocery store, right? Even when I'm, you know, just in everyday kind of relationships, I'm like, okay, take risks, or, you know, this is that moment where you need to engage and not attack, that I have internalized these. I don't always practice them well, but I try to practice them as best I can.
I was going to say something. I just think as a culture, it's, you know, we have a lot of responsibility for our school district. You know, obviously Larry has a ton of responsibility. And I think there's just not a safety in being able, and just in general, this isn't about any one person, there's not a safety in being able to just say areas where we need to grow and where we need to, you know, do better work. And I think that comes partly from the community, because there's an expectation that we can't make mistakes. There's an expectation that we're going to meet the need of every kid. That should be our goal, but inevitably, as Janet often says, where there's a where you have a good intention, there's I'm paraphrasing you, where you have a good intention, there's an unintended consequence, right? And even in our boundary adjustment, we're trying to do good work, but someone's going to be negatively affected, and we can't possibly make it good for everybody. And so I mean, just that comfort, I think, with being able to say, I liked what you said at the beginning, we're going to offend. It's just, and I think maybe Amy said it too today, like, someone's going to be unhappy, and us being able to be, not think that's okay, but being able to be okay with it, and then keep working to improve.
And there's a big difference, thank you, Kimberly, there's a big difference in making an educated choice with an equity lens, where you are looking at, okay, so what's the impact on these different communities? And so then I make a decision kind of being informed, versus operating from colorblind ideology, you know, having no kind of understanding and just going out there and doing it based on your own kind of worldview or perspectives or experiences, right? And that's what I think that we're trying to do. We can't be all things to all people. We can't do all things. We do know that that some communities are being more impacted, in this case in our educational system, than others. We've got to change that, right? That doesn't mean that as we start to work on those things, I'm not just talking about North Shore School District, you know this, right? As we start to do that, there's going to be some loss even from other communities. I mean, when you think about even how white communities who have often not had to kind of look at, like, what does the ways in which they benefit then end up impacting the kids who are not benefiting. You're gonna hear some things. I remember this very well as the Director of Equity and Race, where people start to say, what about my kids? And what about my children? And this is how we're being impacted. So we're gonna look at equity and equality in a moment, because this is what we're gonna be needing to convey to folks about why it is that we're doing this, right? I don't know if any of that made sense.
No, and just to add on to what Kimberly was saying, I think it will be critical for us to extend grace to the rest of our staff as they do this work. And then there's the polarity of caring deeply about the opportunity or the achievement gap as well. So
yeah.
So that will be a difficult balance too.
You know, you might have remembered a while ago in Seattle Public Schools there was a teacher who had been, for years, even when I was there, was talking about racism, privilege, stereotypes in the classroom. And I had been to his class, phenomenal. He'd been teaching for years. And a child comes home from school and tells the parent what he's learning. The parent has no understanding or no formal education around it, and then starts advocating that this no longer be taught, right? It was this huge kind of blow-up thing. I mean, he's back in the classroom teaching, but Janet, as you're saying, that we need to give our teachers grace and our schools grace as they're practicing and trying new things. You need to be, one of your roles is to support them, even when they make mistakes, because if you wait for them to learn how to educate children in culturally competent ways. In other words, if you think that they're going to go from A to Z without some challenges in between, right? These are those moments where you'll have to be curious, and you'll also have to engage parents about what it is that you're trying to do as a district, right? Where it is that you're trying to go, and what you know, doesn't mean that you're not going to try to address whatever it is that occurred, but we don't try to get rid of people, because then they won't feel safe to practice. So it's, again, it is messy. There's a reason why we're not better as a society than we are right now, because people are afraid, and we can't be afraid and serve our children well. So the framework that I'm going to share with you, you have a handout. I don't follow it. It's just to, so you can take a look at it later. It's Daryl and David Sue. Have you ever heard of microaggressions? So I'm going to do some work later on microaggressions. Daryl Sue is not the person who coined the term, but he certainly is the person who brought that language to the level of understanding that people now have of it. But I'm going to share with you their framework, and I'm going to focus specifically on the area of awareness, because this again is where the hardest work is. When they're talking about becoming culturally competent, they are not just talking about race. My area of expertise, I am not an expert, my area of expertise is around race relations. Each one of these areas is work that we all need to do to grow in our ability to effectively serve students. What are the experiences of our Muslim students, for example? What do we need to understand about their needs? What are their, what issues or what experiences do our students have based on gender or on language or ability? This is where we need to all get skilled at. So what I do is, and what I'll be doing with the administrators, is I will be taking them through activities focusing on race as a way to model for them what does it look like to then engage in these conversations around these other areas. So for example, we will look at racial privilege or racial stereotypes, but there are stereotypes in all of these groups. There's privilege in all of these groups, right? So what Sue and Sue say is that as we're developing our cultural competence, it is active work. It's work that we have to be intentional about doing it. You know, otherwise we will find ourselves, you know, it's not until graduate school or later in life where we come to understand something. In other words, our society is set up or structured so that many people don't have to look at issues of diversity. When we're talking about racial diversity, our society is not set up to really, you know, kind of force white people, so to speak, to look at racial diversity. So what they say is that a part of cultural competence is looking at what are the assumptions that we have about people. I was telling you, I think I had told you this, Larry, but even before I had met you, I have in my mind that you would be so much older than you are, right? Like just, I hear superintendent, I talk to a man, and then I form this image. I was at another school district and I found myself surprised that the superintendent was a woman. I've worked under a superintendent who was a woman, but there's these messages that I'm taking in that I find myself constantly kind of finding myself making these assumptions about people. Who can help me with technology? Who is more skilled or what have you? So that's this work. That's what we need to do, is to own that. The other thing they talk about is understanding other cultures, understanding other people's experiences. Do you know how many languages you have in North Shore School District? Approximately?
54.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are cultures within cultures, okay? So it's easier for us to just try to take one kind of way of engaging and then expect that everyone else will follow suit. But Kimberly, you talked about that you have a strong Italian identity. You talked about, Dawn, that you have a multiracial identity. When we look at our history in this country, Italians were forced to assimilate. Irish were forced to assimilate.
And part of the internment in the 1940s and World War.
And assimilation.
You had curfews in Canada.
Yeah, assimilation essentially means that people are being asked to give up aspects of their identity to fit in with the dominant culture's beliefs and values and assumptions. And so in cultural competence work, we're saying that's not healthy. It's not good for anyone. It's not a way to value diversity. What would it look like instead if we honored those differences, if we valued those differences so that people don't have to stop speaking their language or change their last names or their religion or their political preference or whatever it is, and keep those things secret or let them go altogether? Right? But how can I show up in a space and communicate with you in a way that's culturally appropriate for me? Does that make sense to you? I use my hands a lot. I interrupt. That you would be curious or wonder or be able to identify that these are cultural norms for me rather than you having judgment about them and a value judgment at that.
I think there's a danger too in feeding off what you're saying, in lumping all whites together as European, because that, to me, I actually wrote a paper about this in grad school about how that thing of saying all whites, and I think that's relevant, not maybe as much on the West Coast, but like very much on the East Coast, but it probably is here to some degree.
Yeah.
You know, when we say all whites are European, the predominant culture at one point was English, right? If you look at history, that was the imperialism. So there's many whites that don't identify with being necessarily European. And there's, you use the word Eurocentric. My ear went up like this when you said that. You know, it's a Eurocentric way of doing it. I'm like, well, I'm not Eurocentric. You know, that's not the way I do it.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Right. Well, and you know, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So first of all, you will never hear me say all blacks, all whites, all Latinos. I know enough to know that that's one of the problems in this work, that we then end up tending to stereotype. But what I am going to try to get you to engage in these conversations, Kimberly, is that while ethnically you are Italian, racially you are white. And in this country, that means something. And in these conversations, we're trying to get people to look at what has being white meant for you in this society, just like what has being black meant for me. And that therein lies the difficult conversation, because people don't feel like they're being seen, which is the very problem, because I don't get to show up in the parking lot of a car dealership and say, hey, wait a minute, I can afford this car, why are you not all rushing out to try to sell me a car? Like the color of my skin shows up in that moment. And the color of your skin shows up in that moment, and that's where we're trying to have conversation. So it is an and, right? That you are Italian and you are white. The other thing I want to say about this, which is important as well, is what have been the experiences of people because they belong to a particular group. Like, we know that women in our country have gotten less pay compared to men. We know that we've often been kind of treated as inferior in some ways. That history what am I trying to say? That history kind of can dictate how I might show up in relationship with men. Does that make sense to you? That our history is important. And when we understand history, then we can be curious about, I wonder if that's why Caprice is a little, why she's trying to prove herself with me as a man, right? That we need to know what people's experiences have been, so that when we kind of see the tension or notice certain dynamics, that we can become curious if that might be what's operating or taking place in any given moment. So did that? Okay. And then skills, and this is what people want usually when they go in to do workshops. They want me to tell them what they could do to improve, and I wish I could tell you. I mean, I really do. I tell people Oprah Winfrey would bring back her show and put me on it, and I'd be wealthy because I would have all of the answers. But I love that Sue and Sue say that this work of developing skills is practicing. It is developing and practicing, because people are so complex. As you said, I can't lump you in as white. I can't lump you in as being one group. You all have different ethnicities, different family experiences, different cultures. Dawn talked about being Choctaw, that how I engage you might be different from how I engage you, may be different from how I engage you. And so just kind of constantly practicing. The action and the advocacy is really where your work is at. You're looking at how to change policy. You're trying to change institutional practices. Now, you can't change institutional practices if your lens isn't developed. And I think in some ways this is what you were talking about earlier, Larry, when before I had got up and started presenting, when you were talking about the professional development of the board. That if you are going to grow in your cultural competence, no matter where you're at, you have to make a personal and professional commitment to learning, to growing, to engaging in conversations, to practicing. That I tell teachers and educators and people that when I go into organizations, if you wait for the next kind of culturally relevant professional development to come along, you will be moving so slow in this work that you won't be able to look at your work through an equity and inclusion lens. So I encourage people to be reading books, to go to plays, to have conversations, to talk with neighbors and family and friends, and make a personal commitment for your professional development. So they say that this work is a journey. It is not an event. You will never arrive at being culturally competent. Right? You'll never arrive. That it is ongoing, that cultures are always changing. Right? I remember when we had I grew up with a smoking culture, right? Parents smoked in the car with their children. People smoked in the airports, on the airplanes, in the restaurants. And because of people that sat around and changed policy, right? We now have to stand 25 feet away from the door. I say we because I'm a smoker, right? I mean, just when people even know that I'm a smoker, it can change the way in which they see me, which is how much our culture has shifted, right? But this change took time. We went from it being the norm, movie stars, actors smoking on TV, to everybody noticing when a movie star or an actor smokes now. And so knowing that it's just this ongoing work, and as soon as we feel like we've changed one thing, it's time to move on to another, right? So this is what I just shared with you, that as a board, I'm really saying to you that the more work you spend here understanding yourself, understanding how you've been culturally conditioned, the messages that you've taken in, the more knowledge that you have of other cultures, that those two things will help you to think about how to engage differently. Those things will help you to figure out how you have conversations, and it'll also lead to you seeing the very policies that you've been looking at differently. You'll start to notice things, you'll start to hear things, see things in ways that you hadn't seen them before. Okay? I was in so my kids are 13 and 15, my daughter's in the 8th grade. When she was in the 6th grade, my kids go to a private school, which means I get private school privileges, and I am not the parent who shows up at the PTSA meetings. I don't think my child was in 6th grade, I don't think I'd ever gone to a parent-teacher conference. I'm the busy parent that says, I hope you know how to catch the Metro bus to school because I'm off to work. I'm not that bad, but my point is that I missed one of the back-to-school get-togethers where the teachers sit down and talk with the parents and kind of explain the school year. And this teacher had had a second scheduled session for the parents that missed that first one. And there's a new parent at the school. I believe someone who maybe hadn't been in this country for very long. I don't know. I didn't talk to him about how long he'd been here, but his accent was pretty strong. And I'm watching, it was a kind of like a table like this where me and the parent were sitting on this side and the teacher's right really close to us, and we've got a stack of paperwork and she is flipping through it. And she's talking to me the entire time, right? Now, she's talking to me for a couple reasons. One is I'm able to ask questions. Now, I'll tell you, I am rushing through this paperwork. I got my highlighters out. I am like, okay, let me make sure I put this in my calendar. It's a lot of information at the beginning of the school year to try to keep track of. But I'm watching this gentleman next to me, and clearly much of this is going way over his head. It was so much easier for the teacher to just talk to me, because I am engaging her in ways that make her feel comfortable and make her feel like she's doing her job. If she was to engage him, she's going to have to adjust differently. So you're going to have to do some things differently. I kept doing this thing where I kept looking over at him like he's here too, you know, rather than saying anything. I kept kind of saying, I think we're right here, and here's my phone number if you need to talk to someone or if you have any questions or what have you. But she wasn't picking up on these clues. And I think about if she was aware kind of just some of her own biases, some of the messages that she's taken in around people who English might be a second language. If she had knowledge of his culture, if she knew kind of what questions to ask, if she was willing to take risks, and even ask me, hey, can we slow this down a little bit? Or offer for him to come back and do a one-on-one, how her session with us might have looked so differently. You are never going to get a cookbook that tells you one day you are going to be in a situation with someone who is English language. Are you following me? Mm-hmm. These are the practicing things that we do. And the last thing that I'll share about this is that this body work really is about a way of being. It isn't a workshop. It is really about how we engage differently, how we show up differently, and that it's not just white people's work. It is all of our work, because we've all taken in these messages. So let me just take a break here, and why don't we do another pair of shares? A lot of information that I just shared with you. Wanted to give you that framework where you can talk with one another about processing, just process what you're hearing. What are you hearing so far, whether it's about the norms, whether it's about this framework. Yeah, where are you at? Go ahead and just take some time to talk.